Hello. So, how on earth can I possibly dedicate my time to discrediting Glenn Beck? It seems pointless, doesn't it? The main reason is that I think I'm going to have to disappoint everyone and say that there are a lot of people in the world who are, like, just as dumb as Glenn Beck, especially on this issue. And this is the issue of political spectrums and how political spectrums work. And there are a lot of bad ideas that kind of perpetuate this notion that the chart goes from the far right, which is sometimes put as totalitarianism, sometimes it's on the far left, and again sometimes on the far right or sometimes on the far left, anarchy.
But really the scale is totalitarian and anarchy. Those are the edges.
And people argue, I think there are a whole load of ways of doing it, and there are a lot of videos I could put on here. I'm going to respond to Glenn Beck just because he's kind of like an actual person, and it's easy to respond to a person, but there's a chart that starts with like tyranny, and then it has, I think, oligarchy, democracy, republic, anarchy. The republic democracy thing, I will get into at a later point because that also pisses me off. And generally the way it's described. So there are a lot of things Glenn Beck says are wrong.
I want to talk to you a little bit about this chalkboard.
And I could kind of go through each individual point and point out why it's wrong, but what I'm going to do first is actually explain what the political spectrum is.
This is something that when I was over at Fox, I laid out, except I didn't put this part down because I don't think I understood it yet.
And I'm going to explain the political spectrum simply. And I need to clarify a point. Unlike every other person in the world, I'm not coming up with a new political spectrum. I'm not one of those people who says, oh, I can explain the political spectrum much easier than everybody else. Or I can come up with a new political spectrum that explains politics better than the other ones.
This isn't going to come as a brainstorm to very many people, but it is to me, because I think it's the answer.
There are things like the double axis chart, where it's kind of like you've got government control and then economic control, and it's a bit weird because, like, you know, well, government control and economic control are like the same thing, aren't they? You know, if the government controls the economy, then anyway, so that's annoying. Now, I think a lot of people buy into the idea that if you have two axes on a graph, the graph must be more accurate because it's got more quantifiers. The trouble with that is that sometimes having two axes can be prohibitive because it means that you actually have to restrict what your axes represent, because otherwise you can end up with things that don't make sense. Like if your axis is kind of like has two quantities to it, so you have, like, say, imagine you have like state control, or I think what the current chart does is state control on social issues, and then economic control. But because this is two variables, it means that they can't really interact properly, because state control and social control don't necessarily relate, and then when you throw economics into the mix, it's kind of difficult to place yourself. And there are a whole load of other reasons with why that chart is bad, which I'll get into. But the best system, I think, is the original straight line, left to right, not a horseshoe, not a chart, not a pie chart, not anything, just straight line. And it takes you from far left to far right, from fascism to anarchy. And I'll explain how it will make sense. The trouble is, and this is where all of the charts get it wrong, especially Glenn Beck's, and especially anything that kind of tries to make it as a spectrum from freedom to totalitarianism, is that you want to have several definitions, that's how you want to divide things up, because politics isn't a spectrum. Politics is more like a tree, and each branch is kind of a question. And if you want to turn that tree into a spectrum, what you're going to want to do is start with a question, and then that question divides up, and then you have another question that divides up. And that's what I mean when I talk about having several concepts that make your definitions. If you have related concepts that kind of define how each group splits apart, then it means you get kind of a clearer view, and you don't have like a spectrum that's kind of impossible, because a lot of the questions are about definitions. So I'm briefly going to explain why totalitarianism and anarchism don't make sense when you remove sort of quantifiers about what the government ought to be able to intrude in, or what people ought to be able to intrude in, particularly like slavery. Is slavery totalitarianism, or is emancipation totalitarianism? Because emancipation is the government taking the slaves away. So, and you know that's one of the big questions. And I'm not going to get into that now. Incidentally, I'm going to explain socialism, and I am going to explain socialism in a way that kind of defends socialism, is because I'm responding to Glenn Beck. I don't want you to walk away from this video thinking, or go into this video thinking I'm going to try and convince you that socialism is correct. I'm going to explain socialism, but I'm not going to explain it in enough detail for anyone to make a judgment on it. There are a load of good books to read. I might do a reading list thing at some point, if, I don't know, anyone gives a shit. But for now, I'm basically going to continue this very long monologue and explain how the political spectrum works. Actually, I need to just clarify a few more points about historical context. The political spectrum was established in and around the French Revolution. It's probably one of those things where it's oversimplifying it to just say that.
And after we fought the Revolutionary War, we had the Articles of Confederation. And it was as close to anarchy as they could possibly put it without being anarchy. But it was too close, and so it fell apart.
But the idea is that Parliament, both in France and both in the UK and in France, is generally divided into two rows of seats that face each other. I think in this case they meant like a town hall or something, and it was to kind of resolve disputes. And the idea was that the moderate conservatives were supposed to sit on one side, and the radicals were supposed to sit on the other side. And the radicals sat on the left, and the moderates sat on the right. And that from that formed the political spectrum. If you were on the left, you were kind of the radical who wanted to change things and shake things up, and if you're on the right, you sort of wanted to keep everything how it was. And generally, work off what we already had. That is the difference. I know a lot of people are going to complain and say, oh, that's not what the right wing's about. That's what the difference was at the time, and it manifested into a load of other things. So what is the difference between the left and the right? What is the first kind of branching off of these two concepts? It isn't really the difference between radicals and conservatives, because I think radical is a bit of a useless word, as is conservative because, we're fascists. I mean, fascists were quite radical because they did actually change a few things, even though they were working off existing institutions. And I think obviously the best way of splitting the left and the right is to say the left is socialist and the right is capitalist. Now, there are a few things that need to be established before this. I'm going to go into the definition, but and this should illustrate it further, but socialism and capitalism are effectively mutually exclusive. It is impossible to be a bit of a socialist and a bit of a capitalist. And that's because of how the definitions work. It's like saying I'm an atheist who believes in God. If you say I'm a socialist who thinks capitalism can, have a role. I mean, there are some ways you can argue socialism and capitalism can coexist in an ideology, but broadly speaking, for all intents and purposes, no. The second thing we need to understand is private property. I'm not going to explain private property, but around the French Revolution, a lot of books were written about different types of property, which is why socialism is very intricately tied to property. And it's also reason number one why every single chart that attempts to explain the political spectrum fails, because it doesn't ask about what type of property you believe in and like things like that. So I'm going to explain private property. Private property can kind of be understood as the means of production, but it's a bit more nuanced. It's basically the idea of absentee ownership over the means of production. So if you own a factory that can produce things, but you don't use it, you just kind of keep it there. And as a socialist might explain it, you kind of have your factory there, and it sits there, and then around you are all these starving people. And these starving people need a job, and they want to work in the factory. They're like, oh, come on, work in the factory, we'll work in the factory, we'll produce the things, we'll use the things. And then the capitalist kind of goes, yeah, you can work in the factory, but I own it, and in order for you to work in it, you're going to have to give me like 90% of the things you produce. And then the workers go, come on, that's ridiculous, we're going to be the ones working in the factory, you just have it there and not doing anything with it. And then the capitalists go, well, it's my right to not do anything with it, my farm, yeah, people need food, but I own it, and I think I like it just to be how it is, no one's really going to use it. And that kind of interaction is how socialists explain wage relations, how socialists explain how capitalist property interacts with working class. The idea that you can own something which you intentionally don't use for the sake of having other people use it for you and then, making money off it, and that is capitalism. Or private property, I suppose, because capitalism, I think I can give the definition now. Capitalism is the institutional protection of private property. That is your one-sentence definition. Socialism is the effective or enforced abolition of private property. That is your one-sentence definition. Two, cannot combine, and when I use the term definition, I know it's a bit weird to define definition, but when I use the term definition, I use it to mean that if you do not meet this definition, you are not a capitalist. If you do not believe that private property ought to be protected, then you aren't a capitalist. If you do not believe that private property ought to be abolished, you are not a socialist. And if you do believe any of those things, then you are necessarily in that group. So now we've kind of divided it into, we've got our political spectrum, and I just want to make sure my hands are on the, you've got political spectrum, you've got, by the way, it kind of has a mirror effect, so I don't know which side is on the right. If I'm on the wrong side, just, I think this is my right hand, so on the right, you've kind of got capitalism, radical capitalism. On the left you have radical socialism, and then in the middle you have moderates of both. So if there's a moderate capitalism and radical capitalism, there must be a capitalist spectrum, right spectrum. And this again has a one-sentence definition. It is the extent to which the state directly protects private property. I should clarify, I'm using the state in this term to use to mean kind of any institution that has like a lot of force about it and it's organised. So it could include like guerrilla warriors or private insurance companies and things like that, like private police forces. So I'm not using it in the monopoly of violence sense of the word. but more like any institution that has sufficient control over violence that they can effectively defend whatever it is that is their prerogative to defend. And I think, maybe to avoid confusion, a better definition would be the extent to which the institution directly protects private property, or the institution of force. The institution of force directly protects it, which would relate it back to the definition of capitalism given. So if that's the spectrum, what is on the far right of the spectrum? It's fascism, which is the total protection of private property by the state. That's not really a dictionary definition, that's just kind of a way of understanding it. And a lot of the features you see in capitalism are corporate bailouts, the suppression of unions, the suppression of socialists, and obviously wars fought by the state.
Down this far is the Nazis, the communists, and the theocrats. People in our media and in our schools and everything else will try to convince you that the Nazis are right and the communists are left. No, they're not. Neither are the mullahs. They're all here. They're all on this end of the spectrum.
If you look at all of these fascist countries, they are ultra-capitalists. They believe that, workers should be forced to work. We were talking about before, the workers not knowing if they should work in the factories, if they should accept the wage. In fascism, they don't have a choice, and you can't question it. If you stood up in Hitler's Germany and suggested the workers should assume control of the means of production, you would be taken to a camp, or lined up against a wall, and you would be shot. That is the most extreme sense in which you can talk about capitalism. That is the greatest extent to which you can defend private property rights. If that's fascism on the far right, what is on the far left? What is kind of the least role, or the smallest role the institution can have in defending private property whilst still defending it? And here I think the answer would be social liberalism, which would be a system where private property is protected, but the state encroaches on the rights of private property owners in order to provide some level of social equity. So this is a fancy way of saying we would have progressive taxation. Even though you have a state that defends kind of what socialists would see as a very exploitative system that benefits the rich, you also have a state that takes some money away from the rich to give it to the poor and kind of provide better standards of living. And this is obviously kind of a very common approach. Now it's my position that there are basically three types of capitalism. There's a type of capitalism where the state protects private property, and then they use a lot of force and violence and suppression in order to prevent an uprising. And then you've got the other type of capitalism where the state protects private property, but it uses sort of social concessions and attempts at bringing about equity in order to kind of provide less reason for the workers to revolt, and therefore it provides protection for the state. Now, what is the third type of capitalism? The third type of capitalism is a system in which private property is protected, and outside of that the state intervenes very little. Private corporations would take on a lot of the functions of the state that we usually think of being, especially in the UK, things like health. In other countries, things like the energy sector. These would all be under private administration, and all the state does is kind of do the limited role that it's often prescribed to do in classical liberal thought, which is to protect individual rights, like basic human rights, and especially property rights, including private property rights. And this is why people like Stuart Mill argued for democracy. They argued for democracy, but they said, let's not give people under a certain income or with a small amount of property the vote, and let's give people with lots of property more votes. And because we want rights, but we don't want the workers to take control of private property, because that's not what we're about. We're capitalists. Now we call the system nowadays neoliberalism, and we call it libertarianism, and we can also still call it classical liberalism. The differences between classical liberalism and neoliberalism are probably there, but it's really kind of not worth going into just to get a broad idea of the political spectrum. There's also, it's possible that in the system, which is why I clarified that it can be an institution rather than the state, that you can have a stateless system, so anarcho-capitalism, which would be when the private police force protects the private property, and that's a whole other thing. I disagree with anarcho-capitalism, so I'm not going to go into exactly why, but you know, it kind of has a place on the political spectrum, but it is a bit of an outlier, which is kind of okay because it's generally not taken into account in political science or in general mainstream discourse. So it kind of makes sense that it doesn't really fit very well because it goes against a lot of ideas. Now it might seem restrictive to say there are only 3 types of capitalism: the fascist, neoliberal, social liberal, and that's kind of because it is, and I do generally support or kind of talk about a 4th form of capitalism, which is neoconservatism. Neoconservatism is basically between neoliberalism and fascism.
And so cut this even into a smaller pie.
It says, yeah, the state should mostly be about defending private property, but you know, maybe we should go to Iraq to get some oil, or maybe we should go to Vietnam because they're socialists.
And we are moving closer to that end of the spectrum.
It's infinitely better than capitalism, but it's still notably corporatist. You might have noticed I said infinitely better than capitalism. I meant to say infinitely better than fascism. Sorry for the confusion. And, you know, it still has the corporate bailouts, and it's probably the more logical counterpoint to social liberalism. I guess mostly because the fascism is kind of so far right that really you would think of anarchism as this opposition, whereas neoconservatism is kind of within the spectrum that we think about mainstream politics. And one of the things Glenn Beck says, which is correct, is that we mostly live in a society where everyone's kind of in the middle of the right wing.
Right now, after the election, we have everybody, we have all these Republicans saying we've got to abandon our principles, we've got to become more liberal, and what they want to do is they want to move closer to the Democrats.
Although he uses it in a different sense, but that's his opinion. I mean, that's kind of, you know, the spectrum he did that I disagree with him and trying to refute. So yeah, most current politics exists from neoliberalism to neoconservatism, and I'm not talking about social issues in this. I don't think it's that relevant, honestly. So we're talking about kind of the way the state interacts with the economy and with property. That's what we mean when we talk about the political spectrum. We don't need to throw in gay marriage, we don't need to throw in abortion. Alright, so now I'm basically just going to very quickly go through the left wing and socialism. It's harder to explain the reason behind the way the spectrum works in socialism, but when you lay it out, it kind of makes sense. Like, you can see where it's coming from if you just lay out all of the ideologies. So I'm actually just going to explain kind of the major ideologies that get you from your centre left to far left. So centre left, far left. No. Centre left, far left. There we go. So you start off with social democracy. Nope, social democracy. And social democracy is basically the idea that the government slowly nationalises resources to kind of gradually bring many parts of the state under government control, but it doesn't really believe in achieving socialism right away. It's not the sudden abolition of private property, but it still counts because it's, you know, if the end goal is the abolition of private property, then it's like social democracy. Did I use the term social democracy? I hope I did. Or did I use the term social liberalism? So it's characterised by slow reform, kind of obvious why it would be regarded as the moderate position, And then I think a bit along you get state socialism, which is the idea that the government controls all of the means of production and does this very quickly, a la Marxist-Leninism, a la Maoism, a la, I'm not sure what they call it, Castroism? I don't know if he had an ism after him. But you know, all sort of the socialist systems were kind of based around this state socialist principle. And then you move to the left more, and you get religious socialism, which is the idea that the church controls everything and is sort of all, I mean, it's kind of obvious what it is. It's worker control of the means of production surrounded by the church as the main institutional force. And then you move on to market socialism, which is the idea that basically the workers control the means of production and the state doesn't interfere in the economy. But it also allows for the state to exist. So the state might still exist for various reasons, but it doesn't interfere in the economy. It doesn't protect private property rights, it doesn't redistribute anything. Nothing like that, and people just trade freely amongst themselves. So that's market socialism. And market socialism brings us quite clearly to anarchism, which is market socialism minus the state, I feel like. So it's the idea that people can trade freely amongst themselves. If there, I mean, there are kind of different models, but broadly speaking, people can trade freely, people can work freely, everything's very free, there's no state, there's no protection of private property. And this would be an example of the effective abolition of private property as opposed to the enforced abolition of private property. So the idea is that people just work freely without kind of giving up any of the stuff they produce. They just own the things they produce. No, the way I would understand kind of how the spectrum works is that you move to a more radical position further left, depending on how much you believe modern current institutions are compatible with socialism.
This is a false choice. Here's where the growth comes. If you really want revolutionary thinking, if you really want to save our country, that's why I've been saying lately, forget about the parties. It's not going to happen in Washington because they refuse to think out of this little box because that's where all their power is. But if you really want to know how to gather a storm, how to gather enough people, you come and you look between this one and this goalpost.
So under social democracy, you sort of believe that a democratic system of the state slowly nationalising certain things, which is what we've already seen, like with old Labour in the UK, is the most is not only the best way to advance socialism, but also very compatible with our current models of society. And then you move on to state socialism, which is very, it steps up the game a lot by immediately taking over control of the means of production, but it's also very statist in its applications, and statism is a big part of kind of capitalism and historical ways of organising society. So it's still sort of a more moderate position because it's still advocating we need the state to control property. People can't do it themselves. The state needs to protect people from the capitalists, things like that. And then you move on to religious socialism, we've got rid of the state now, but at the same time we still have religious institutions, and socialism and religious institutions generally they're seen as quite regressive and part of the old way of life. And then you move on to market socialism. Now the state hardly exists at all. The state is just sort of overseeing everything, but it doesn't interfere with people's lives, and people just work freely. Free labour, free markets is one way of putting it. But yeah, very little government interference. And then finally you get anarchism.
This is Occupy Wall Street. They're past the Articles of Confederation, and some of them believe, I don't even know how, they're anarchist, say it for me, Penn.
Anarchists.
Anarchists that are communist and socialist as well. That's not, I don't understand how that's even possible. No government and total government.
Which removes everything. It removes the state. It removes to extending. It removes markets under some models. It can often remove religion, and if you like, kind of the very furthest left is communism, which is a stateless, classless, raceless, sexless, as in genderless system. No money, nothing. It's kind of a complete redraft of what we think of when you think of society, and that is the furthest away from what we currently have. And that 30-minute video should kind of explain how the political spectrum works. You start on the left, you go, actually I'll start on the right, fascism, neoconservatism, neoliberalism, social liberalism, social democracy, state socialism, religious socialism, market socialism, anarchism, communism. And that is it. The political spectrum explained very simply. Now I need to just draw together a few points about how this exactly works, or why it's good. It's good because it kind of places everything, like, I mean, all of the major beliefs are on there. They're very fairly represented, I think. I don't think there was a single ideology that I described how someone from that ideology wouldn't describe it. And they all seem to fit together quite logically. You know, that progression seemed to make a lot of sense. And I explained very clearly how it is the progression works. Maybe socialism, you could argue, my definition of it being how compatible modern institutions are is a bit vague. But hopefully, if you ever scratched your head and thought, well, I thought communism and fascism were the same thing or anything like that, you now understand exactly how political scientists mean to talk about the words